Terrible. Okay, it says we are live. All right, I'm going to my page. I know everybody's so tired of me doing this at the beginning of the episode, saying, "Oh, are we live yet?" And
well,
we
it is
are
a
live.
first.
Yes, that was fast. Well,
this is a first for me, so yeah.
Yes, this is the fastest we've ever been live. Well, hello everyone out there in Facebook land. I'm Mitzi Szereto, and I am back again with a live event for the best new true crime stories, serial killers, this wonderful anthology. And I am being joined from the UK live and in person by Danuta Kot. Hi, Danuta.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being on here. This is great. This is all actually going smoothly. Let's hope nothing happens.
Well, that's just guaranteed something will now, but never mind.
Yeah, I jinxed it. How are you doing in our lockdown?
Well, it's pretty weird actually, because I live on my own, so I haven't really seen anyone apart from at a distance for 6 weeks now. We've been in it, apart from my dog Doris, who was supposed to be in here to do a cameo performance, but she seems to have disappeared. And we're sort of getting on with it. Most people are sticking to it. And the numbers are going down, but from a high start. So who knows, but how on earth we're going to get out of this, I have no idea.
No, I expect to be wearing my N95 mask for the next year. And no, I did not take those from medical people. I actually had them left over from 2 years ago during some very bad wildfires. Oh, right. Yeah, right, so thank God I had them in the cupboard. I'm like, yay! I'm surprised no one's like mugged me to get my N95 off of me. It's like going out like in a hazmat suit, masks, gloves, like with sunglasses just to check my eyes. I'm like, this is a perfect time for bank robberies,
Absolutely. I hadn't thought of that. Right. Okay. I'm starting my new career tomorrow.
Yeah, let's. I'll have to check my next royalties statement to find out if I needed to start that career too. So, well, I'm so pleased that you were able to join us. And you have written a story for the book called "The Stranger in the Square," and this is quite an interesting and a bit of a departure from what you might expect for true crime, because it's a memoir-esque type of piece.
Yes.
And I just was also going to say, before I start that, I wanted to say that I have not seen you in years since we did the Getting Even Revenge Stories book.
I remember that. Yes.
So I wanted to get that in, because that just seems like that was like a lifetime ago. It really was. The good old days.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So anyways, The Stranger in the Square, which you wrote, and can you give us a brief overview of your chosen subject for that?
Right. Well, what I was writing about happened in the UK just before we had a series of incredibly brutal murders of women by a killer who was dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper eventually, because he struck in Yorkshire, in various Yorkshire cities, Leeds, well, he did also Lancashire. He did kill someone in Manchester, but mostly in Yorkshire, Leeds, Bradford, Keighley. And he came across to Sheffield, though where I live, he never actually killed anyone there. And we found out years later that he had actually seriously attacked several women before he began his actual killing spree. And when they caught him, I can remember seeing the photograph and getting this absolute chill, because I had had a very disturbing encounter just weeks before the first proper attested Ripper killing, with a man in Havelock Square in Sheffield, which at that time was what's known as the red light district, where the prostitutes used to go. And this man killed prostitutes mostly. Not every one of his victims by any means was a prostitute, but he started off with killing prostitutes. The police said, oh, he hates prostitutes. He's the street cleaner. And that's sort of what he said at his trial. God made me do it. God has a lot to answer for. what they never seemed to cross their minds was that, of course, someone like that will go after prostitutes because they are right out there, they're obvious victims. But the thing is, when I saw the photograph, I realised that the man who had accosted me in Havelock Square was this man, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, and that I had been, in fact, incredibly lucky. Sort of force of circumstance, the fact that he hadn't quite got into his rhythm, if you like, at the time, the fact that someone came at the right moment. I can just remember a moment when I absolutely froze when I realised that this apparently friendly nuisance, who appeared to be mistaking me for a prostitute, which happened around there, you sort of got used to it, actually had very, very different intentions towards me. And that moment I can still remember. And it happened at a very sort of disturbing time in my life as well. And so I thought I would write about it. I never had before. And I started writing about it, and it turned into this memoir, because though I give a detailed account of meeting, my encounter with Peter Sutcliffe in Havelock Square, it's mostly about, well, a tragedy really in my life that was ongoing at the time, when my partner in those days was in hospital and desperately, seriously ill. And the reason I was in Havelock Square at night was because I was cutting through a shortcut on my way back from visiting him in the hospital. And it just kind of, I'd obviously had this story in my mind for a long time, and it just kind of flowed out, and there it was, the stranger in the square.
Yeah, I remember you had said that it was when you were writing it, it really brought up a lot of emotions and that, and it is a very emotional story. It's a very poignant story. I don't think that anybody could read it without being emotionally affected by it, because it's almost like, it's really like two parallel stories. And yeah, I mean, when you were telling me that you wanted to write that, I was like, oh, this sounds like this is going to be definitely something special. Now, I mean, as far as Peter Sutcliffe's MO, you don't get into the gore of the story, which, I mean, that could have very easily have been done, but it just wasn't necessarily something you needed to do. But what was his actual MO as far as killing these women?
Well, the survivors report, the ones that remember what happened, that he would come up to them and start talking, just something fairly easy like good evening or something like that. And with some of them, he walked for quite a while chatting, especially I think in the early days when he was sort of getting up to speed, as it were. But he hit them with a ball peen hammer on the head very, very hard. The women had several very severe fractures to the skull, and the survivors have deep, marks. I don't know what you call them, dents, I suppose, in their skull where he hit them. Yeah. And then he would attack them with knives, and the attacks got more and more brutal. He would knife them, or use a long, like a screwdriver. I don't think it was necessarily a knife. And he would stab them several times, sometimes stabbing them through the same wound, sort of horrible, strongly sexual motive there, though he only ever raped one of his victims. He would then leave them. I think he would pull their skirts up. He draped the boots over one corpse. He went back to the body of one woman and moved her when she wasn't found.
Brutal.
A brutal and disgusting killer. Yes.
Yeah. Clearly another misogynistic serial killer, of which we seem to have quite a few. Now, this was in, was this the 80s? or the 70s.
70s. Yes, I would have to check my dates very quickly. It's awful to say, but you forget
Well,
when
we
these.
have so many other things keep coming up, and it just like, who can keep track anymore?
Yes. 1975 was when it happened to me, and that was the start of the killings. And I think they finally, 6 years later, I think it was, 81, that they actually arrested him. And that was in Sheffield, and that was by accident.
Wow, yeah. I lived in Sheffield for many years, but it was way after the Yorkshire Ripper. But yeah, I mean, I'd heard of him, but I really, didn't know that much about him. Give us a sense of how it was like living in that time period. Obviously, you talk a lot about how the cultural, especially for women and young women, and the attitudes of men toward women. Kind of give us an overview of that.
Well, it's so different now, but I think I describe in the book walking up West Street, which is one of the main sort of drinking boulevards in Sheffield, and the men coming out of the pubs drunk used to just routinely say the most vile things to any woman who was going past on her own, because women on their own were, you shouldn't really be out on your own, not at that time, not in those days. And they were traveling gangs, and it was always intimidating. You just sort of walked past, and you were supposed to sort of appreciate sexual comments that were supposed to be seen as compliments. That's why I get very angry when people say you should be flattered when people wolf whistle today, because I can remember the kind of stuff we had to put up with then. And you couldn't really guarantee any protection from, say, the police, because they too thought you shouldn't be out in the streets at night on your own. You should be there with your protector, and i.e. your boyfriend, your partner, your husband, whatever. So there was that, but you got very thick-skinned about it. It just was a part of life. But one of the things I do remember as well is that I wasn't frightened about walking down the back streets at night. I used to cheerfully cut through Broom Hall, which is a very rundown, very beautiful old Victorian, sort of built in the days of the Victorian prosperity and the big mills and things like that. The mill owners used to be like to be near their trade. Trees, shadowed gardens, big old stone houses all turned over to multiple occupancy. Walked through those without a flicker. In a way, it was probably safer than the main streets, because it was usually busy. It was the red light district. The prostitutes were out. And the worst danger that you were in was of someone mistaking you, a curb crawler mistaking you for a prostitute. And they were very quick to sort of accept that at the very least you weren't working then if you just ignored them and walked past. By the end of the Yorkshire Ripper's time, I would go a long way out of my way. I didn't drive, so I just walked everywhere, a long way out of my way to keep off empty and deserted streets. He made us all frightened, and I resent that, because strangely enough, in those misogynistic times, we weren't frightened. When you read about what was happening, we weren't frightened enough, actually. I mean, one of the many reasons it was so difficult for the police to catch the Yorkshire Ripper, apart from some blinding incompetence, was that the country was littered with murdered women. Violence, domestic violence was ignored. Violence from man towards his girlfriend was ignored. And generally, the murder of prostitutes was seen as an occupational hazard. Things are much better now, but I've never quite lost that fear, and I resent this, of walking down the street and hearing someone behind me and thinking, who's that? And in the days that I write about, I never thought that. We just didn't, or I didn't anyway.
Yeah, it's almost a loss of innocence. Even, I mean, at least if the lads had too much to drink and they make some inappropriate comments, it's sort of like, well, what else is new? And you
Yes, I
could
mean, yes. If you'd said to them,
continue on your way. I
yes,
mean,
yeah, come and
yeah,
get it, baby, they would have gone, oh, uh, yeah, they were a nuisance. They weren't a threat.
yeah. Usually, if anybody would have kind of gotten in their face, they probably would have run off smoking a mummy. Yeah, but no, exactly. I mean, the scene where you describe it, walking home and feeling in good spirits, and then this so-called friendly man, and I suppose that's really how it is. I mean, that's how Bundy was so successful in his serial killing career, and just this nice, personable young man that you wouldn't fear.
Yes, attractive. And if he came up in the right way, most women would respond, I think, quite positively to him. As you say, attractive, looked very respectable. Apparently, he was polite and courteous and all of that. It's important to remember that serial killers, haven't got fangs and horns and things like that.
Yeah, well, there are some that probably do look a bit like serial killers, but this is true. I mean, the majority are just like the normal, supposed normal person that, your friend, your neighbor, your friend's brother, whatever. I mean, they're all somebody from somewhere. So,
yes, Peter Sutcliffe was a good-looking young man, thick, dark hair, quite a heavy beard, nice dark eyes, nice smile, and the only reason I was wary of him at first when he came up to me, and first of all, he just said good evening or nice evening, I can't quite remember.
And in Sheffield, that's a normal thing to do. People do greet you and are very friendly.
Oh, yes, yes. You wouldn't think twice about it. I was a little bit annoyed because I wasn't feeling in a mood for a chat, but I just sort of was perfectly friendly. And then he did say something that made it clear that he thought I was a prostitute, and I just thought, oh, he was not a curb crawler, a curb walker, if you like. And yes, I just sort of, very sharply said that I got it wrong, and that's when it started to get weird and frightening. But like I say, I was lucky someone came along, because a few months before that, he'd done something very similar to a young woman. I think, did she live in South Yorkshire, or was it even in Derbyshire? She's now officially identified as someone that he attacked, and he has admitted it. She was walking home, and this guy walked up the road with her, chatting to her. She was only about 16, I think. And then he got behind her, he dropped back, which is what he did with me, and hit her several times with a hammer, and I think chucked her over a wall. Someone came along and he chucked her over a wall, but she survived. And the police at the time never chased it up. And they had at least 3 survivors who suffered very similar attacks, who had given very similar descriptions of the man. And yet they ignored it because they had this tape. And all these women said this guy had a Yorkshire accent, which Peter Sutcliffe did. But the tape, the I'm Jack tape, if anyone isn't familiar with that, if you Google Yorkshire Ripper, I'm Jack, you can probably still, Wearside Jack, you can probably still hear the tape, and it is quite chilling. But it wasn't him, it was a prankster who they arrested about 8 years ago, I think. He was sent to prison. They finally tracked him down. And everyone was telling the police, because they put everything into this. Not everyone, I mean, we all thought, oh, wow. The police seemed to be saying, there are things on this tape that we're not going to reveal, but they tell us things only the killer could know, which wasn't true. There was nothing there. Everything that was there, you could have got from the newspapers. And they got some dialect experts who tracked it down. In those days, dialect differences in the UK were very, very clear and distinct. They're not bad now, but there's a lot more mixing. But they tracked it down to a particular village in the northeast of England. He had what's called a Geordie accent.
Yeah.
And they said, you must have interviewed the guy on this tape. You must have done. You've been there. We know where he lives from the way he speaks. If all the people you've interviewed have alibis you can't break, then you have interviewed this speaker and he is not the Yorkshire Ripper. But they wouldn't listen. And so they reckon that probably cost the lives of at least 4 women, maybe more, because it derailed the inquiry massively. They put everything into that. Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed, was it 8 or 9 times? He drove a lorry, and they knew he had to be a long-distance driver. He worked at a firm that had received money from a batch. They knew from retrieving a note in a prostitute's handbag that had money from that batch. And so he was one of few firms where this man must work. His car had been seen in red light districts so many times, and the only alibi he had was his wife. If you shoved that lot into a computer, there'd be a great big red flashing arrow going, there he is. But even without the computers, it was criminal that they missed it.
So he had a wife as well, and he
did, yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's not the only serial killer that had a wife and still went on. Did he actually use the prostitutes' service, or did he just target them?
He just targeted them. We don't know what he did with prostitutes when he wasn't on a killing spree, but the only prostitute he had sex with was a young woman called Helen Ritker, and that was after he'd sort of incapacitated her with the hammer. The judge at the trial was very scathing about that. He said, "You're telling us that this is not sexually motivated," and because the women that he killed, they'd lived tough lives. They were often drug addicts, and they often looked it. But Helen Ritker was a young, pretty girl, only just really started her life on the streets, real tragedy. And he said, along comes pretty little Helen Ritker, and suddenly you have sex with her. And what he said when he made a statement to the police was, she didn't put much into it. What is this,
Yeah. But, crazy. I mean, your frustration with actually the whole handling of the case comes through very clearly in this story. I mean, we hear so many times about when they're sex workers, that just somehow well, obviously they're quite easy to victimize. They're right there. They're often the victims, but what kind of mishandling and the attitude of the police toward these women? I mean, if these would have been, I know you said not every single victim was a prostitute. That's also a myth that they were all prostitutes, correct?
Oh, yes, yeah. Very much so. His early victims were either prostitutes or women who lived fairly chaotic lives. And the police separated the victims into innocent victims and prostitutes. And then there were the women who, I think in the police's point of view, were sort of a little bit in between. Women who went out on their own, women who went out into pubs for drinks with their friends and things like that, very dodgy people. Yes. And the first woman who was killed, who was not by association a prostitute in the police's eyes, at least 2 before then were not, but they lived fairly chaotic lives. This was a young 16-year-old girl who was killed coming home in the small hours after a night out with her boyfriend. And the police made a big deal about this, and really, that was when the media started thundering in indignation. They got quite interested in him because a serial killer would always get the tabloids out. certainly the British tabloids, and I should imagine it's much the same in the US to the extent that you have tabloids. But suddenly we had this, now he's killed all these prostitutes, but now he's killed this innocent young girl, and this
Innocent, yeah.
will not do. Yeah. And then he killed a young student in Manchester. He killed a young building society clerk in Leeds, I think that was. Another young woman. I think he moved away from prostitutes after that. I think he'd realized he could actually get away with, just a little bit of care, if you like. He could get away with killing any woman he liked. He killed a doctor, though she wasn't recognized as a Ripper victim for ages. In fact, I don't think until they arrested him and he did start confessing that they realized that she was, because we all thought he'd gone really quiet. There hadn't been a Ripper killing for several months. And the police were speculating that he might have committed suicide, but in fact he killed someone and they hadn't noticed. His last victim, well, she wasn't actually a victim, his last almost victim was a prostitute. And this is my interesting second connection with the Yorkshire Ripper murders. I actually knew her. I didn't know her well, but she'd been in as mother and baby accommodation. It was this very well-meaning charity, and I shouldn't be unkind, I suppose, but they bought a big old stone house in Broome Hall, right in the middle of the red light district, and they'd set it up as bedsits with an on-site warden for young single parents, because in those days getting a flat if you were on your own with a child was really, really difficult, and this was part of a process of getting people into here, and then they moved on to housing association flats after that. So it was a good idea, it wasn't just well-intentioned, it was useful. But some of the women who lived there, not all of them by any means, but some of them came from very chaotic backgrounds and lived very chaotic lives. They couldn't deal with money very well. They were always broke. And they opened this thing bang in the middle of the red light district. And several of them went out to make a bit of money on the streets. They could put their baby down, hop out, work for an hour, come back with enough money for see them through the next day. And that happened a lot. And I think this particular woman, Olivia Reevers, started working as a prostitute while she was there. And as a friend of mine lived there. She, I hasten to add, wasn't a prostitute, just needed a flat. Sorry, my computer keeps making strange noises. I would meet Olivia going up and down the stairs with her little girl, and, we'd say hi and smile to each other. And that was the extent to which we knew each other. But it was really the next day when it suddenly turned out that a bit of routine policing had actually netted the Yorkshire Ripper. And the police who carried out the arrest did actually make some good choices, because they phoned the Ripper squad, who said, "Oh, we've interviewed him, he's okay, he's clear." So he nearly got let go again. But they went back to the site where they picked him up, not far from where I live actually, because he'd asked to go for a pee, nipped behind the bushes, and the guy went and checked, and there they found a ball pen hammer and one or two other things hidden in the bushes, because they were after Olivia for soliciting, not the man she was with. Of course, they took him in anyway. And that was it. And there, next day, on the front page of the newspapers was Olivia being interviewed on television, very tearful and shaky, as you can imagine if you found you've come within minutes of having your brains bashed out. So, as I say, they caught him by accident, but they did catch him, and it did change policing quite a lot after that. It brought computers in, because a computer would have spotted him very, very quickly. And I think it also, like to think it brought more women into policing. There were no senior women working on the Ripper team, none at all. It changed a lot of attitudes, I think, but that's no consolation to the people who lost members of their family, loved ones, their mothers, their wives, their children.
Well, I think in that time period that probably would have been the situation pretty much anywhere, is just the attitudes and the dismissal of the victims, and almost this sort of thing like, well, what were you doing out anyways?
Exactly. Yeah.
Why were you at the pub? Why were you walking down the street after dark? And it's just,
Yeah.
well, you would never ask a man that question.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So you must have wanted to have your head beaten in, or you wouldn't have been there.
That's what I enjoyed, having my skull bashed in. Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's at least, I know it's no consolation to the victims or their families and their loved ones, but I mean it is a positive thing that things have moved on. I mean, if there was if Peter Sutcliffe was roaming Yorkshire now, I would assume this would have been nipped in the bud a lot quicker, and with a much better outlook, with the police actually, taking these things seriously.
Oh yes, it would have been totally different, and of course the police would have had much more sophisticated forensics as well. But they would have had a better attitude, and they would have taken the women who gave them good information much more seriously, and they wouldn't have accepted the word of a man if the only corroboration was his wife. This is not to say that wives collude, but I just think, if you're married to someone and he kept his two lives very separate, his family, he had quite a big family, had no idea. One of his brothers later said he had wondered, but other than that, I don't think there were any suspicions. My husband has said to me, I was with you on Saturday night, wasn't I? So if we were talking 2 or 3 weeks ago, I would have said, wouldn't have thought about it. I don't think he had a second career as a serial killer, I hasten to add. But when, you just tended to do that, because I don't think there was any suggestion of collusion. It just never occurred to her that her husband could possibly have been the Yorkshire Ripper.
Yeah. It's interesting, because actually for my next book, there's a story about it was a serial rapist, and he's also married, and again no inkling. It seems like this seems to be a common thing. Either that, or these people just live in la la land and they ignore a lot of things.
It's entirely possible. I mean, the BTK killer was married, wasn't he? And his wife seemed to have no idea of what he was doing. In fact, he was a real little job's worth around the town, and nobody realized. Dennis Rader, that's his name. Yeah, nobody realized, and he was one of the most brutal killers there's ever been. It makes you sort of look at the people around you and think, how well do I know them, really?
Well, they say you never really know anybody, and I suppose that's true. We just have to cross our fingers and hope whoever we're surrounding ourselves with are okay. Yeah. Again, for those listening and watching, Danuta's story is called The Stranger in the Square, and it's about the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, and her experience living through this time, and by a bit of good luck, not becoming one of his victims. I mean, I'm glad you didn't, because I've enjoyed knowing you and working with you in the past. So, and I'm sure you've enjoyed having some books out and having, and being here today.
Yes, I've liked what I've done since. So on the whole, I'm pretty glad as well.
That's just as well then. I wanted to thank you, and I also wanted to give you a big congratulations on your CWA Dagger Award that you won recently.
Oh, thank you. That was for another short story. This one was fiction this time, called The Dummy's Guide to Serial Killing, which I had great fun writing.
That sounds like a book I should have done. Well, that's the first thing when I saw that title, I thought, that's right up my street. Are you working for those people who may not? You also write as Danuta Ray for many years. You've published a lot of books under that, so now you've really got two names to confuse us with, right?
I have, yes. It's a long story. It's incredibly confusing. But I'm writing as Danuta Kot now, which is my my maiden name, my family name. That's Kot, Kot. As in the true crime. As in the true crime serial killers thing. And I'm working on my second novel under that name. I've written 6 as Danuta Ray, and this is my second one as Danuta Kot. And it's set on the it's actually my third one. Sorry, I'm working on now. My second one comes out in October. It's set on the east coast of the UK in Yorkshire and Humberside. I like Yorkshire as a writing location.
It's a
And
wonderful place.
yes, yeah. The coast up there is riddled with old mine workings and old railway tunnels and things like that. It's a wonderful setting for writing, sort of strange shenanigans and goings on and things like that. It's also a very poor area, so people have got to make their money somehow, and they do.
Well, you're welcome to tell us what's the book that's coming out in October. What's the name of it?
It's called Someone Who Isn't Me, and it's about the same people, more or less. There's a young woman, she's in her early 20s, called Becca, who comes from a very chaotic background and who was sort of saved from a life that could have spun completely out of control by her foster parents, an older couple called Kay and Matt. And at the end of the first book in the series, Life Ruins, Kay is coming to terms with the death of her husband, Matt. She's a widow. But she's also still in touch with some of her foster children, and she's in touch with and very close to Becca. Becca's life has spun out of control. She's lost her college place, and the story is about trafficking of young women on the East Coast and how Becca stumbles across it, and how she and a young man she meets called Jared and Kay all get tied up in this, greatly to their danger and detriment. And Someone Who Isn't Me, Becca is trying to stabilize her life again, but gets involved peripherally with a drug gang. She doesn't intend to, and she doesn't know that she is, but they think that she knows more than she does, and this starts causing her a lot of trouble. Kay, meanwhile, is living in an amazing place called Sunk Island, which is just below Hull and is a sort of a low-lying bit of area where it's absolutely wide open for smuggling. And the book opens with the death of a young police officer down in Sunk Island, and then we track the events of his death through there, and he has links to Becca, and then gradually Kay is drawn in, and it all ends up, or could end up, very nastily when you've got an estuary, old drains, and all sorts of things like that around. But that's out in October, so I hope you're doing some more promotional work for that nearer the time.
Great. I can see the ITV. Are you listening?
Please, please, that would be lovely.
Well, if production never starts back up again, I'm getting worried that Corey's going to run out, and then it's like, what are we going to do?
I know, yes.
Nobody's filming, People, yes, I saw somebody, one of my Facebook friends posted something about my new novel's just been bought. It's it's going to be produced by so and so, and somebody with some wet blanket said, "Yeah, but nobody's filming."
Yes. I'm trying to imagine a crime novel which is filmed with individual people in different locations, all holding their own cameras.
10 different little squares where each thing is having something, or else it's going to be all 6 feet apart with masks on. I don't know how you'll do the pub drinking scenes for that and poke a little hole in the mask.
That would be a bit tricky, that one. Yes.
A straw.
The world is ripe for a Zoom movie, aren't they? A thing with the avant-garde film with 10 squares on. And
you don't need
you could do a murder
budgets.
One. Yes, and gradually, one by one, the people in the squares disappear as the killer gets them. Which one of the square is, and how is he doing it at a distance?
There you go. Oh, I got to write this down now and get to it.
We'll all start writing it, yes.
Well, again, Danuta Kot's story, The Stranger in the Square, in the best new true crime stories, Serial Killers, which is out now. And you definitely need to buy this book. And
Absolutely.
you don't always have to go to Amazon, there's many other booksellers that you can order books from and get them sent to your front door. So if Amazon says, oh, we can't promise delivery, then go somewhere else.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and say hello to Doris.
I will do that,
Is
yes.
Danuta's doggie, the famous Doris.
She is. She's very cute, but she's not very cooperative, and she's not cooperating today.
Well, she's got other things to do tonight. I guess maybe she's some horror film on telly or something, or some sexy dog film.
Something like that. She's probably out in the garden looking for something to kill, actually.
Oh, dear. Well, you see, this is it when your mom's a crime writer, right?
What can you do?
Well, thanks so much for coming on, and take care of yourself and stay away from germy people.
I will. Well, thank you, Mitzi. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's great seeing you again.
Okay, bye. Yeah,
bye.